Hello, my name's Mari Wernham. I'm a freelance international child rights consultant, and I work for an organisation called CREATE, Child Rights Evaluation Advice and Training Exchange. And over the years, I've done lots of trainings on juvenile justice and child rights, and I would like to just quickly share a few diagrams that I found very useful to explain to people in a simplified way some key issues around children and child rights. So one that I use quite often is this spider web of child development. So if this was in a training context, you would have this prepared in advance and you would ask the audience, well, you know, children develop in all sorts of different ways as they grow up. And in fact, this development never stops. We as adults are still developing as well. But there are four main areas in which children develop. And if this was a training situation, you would ask the audience to guess what those areas are. To save time, I'm just going to tell you. So physical. Okay. Children physically get bigger. So if you imagine as they grow up, see, they get bigger. But in order to grow physically, they need certain inputs. And then you would ask the audience, well, what do they need? And then people would reply, well, they need good food, nutritious food, they need exercise, they need a clean environment, and so on and so on. So you would elicit from the audience the things that are needed for good, steady physical development. Okay, another area is cognitive development, which is a fancy word for the thinking processes in the brain. And then again, you would ask, well, what do children need? Well, they need a good education, they need the opportunity to do problem solving, and so on and so forth. And the more of those inputs they have, the more they will develop. Some other areas very important for juvenile justice issues is social and moral development. So the things that a child needs here are good role models, a safe and caring background, good education around these types of issues, and so on. And the final one is physical, cognitive, social, moral, and emotional. Sorry, nearly forgotten that. So good emotional development, to be well balanced, to have good relationships with other people. What does a child need there? Again, similar things, a caring, strong attachment to at least one adult, and so on. So you would get these examples from the audience, and then you start to look at children who may not have some of these developments. So what if they don't have good, nutritious food? What if they're not being given the opportunities to develop cognitively, emotionally, and so on and so forth? So for example, think of a child in a street situation who's having to fend for themselves. Now, it may be that they're physically growing a lot bigger. So you can get like a 15-year-old who looks pretty tough, who can look like an adult, which also has issues for discerning age when it comes to criminal responsibility as well. However, if they haven't had somebody to tell them what's right and wrong, they might think, oh, well, yeah, okay, so if I break the law, I know that it's against the law, but actually the child doesn't really understand why, is not really able to understand the consequences that their actions have on other people, and so on. So you may be faced with uneven development in a child, particularly in the justice system, and this is something that you really have to kind of bear in mind. How can you expect them to do the right thing if they haven't had the inputs that maybe you and I have had? So I found this quite useful with professionals, just to kind of simplify a bit the situation of children that they might be faced with in these circumstances. So that's kind of uneven development or lack of development. You can also use this when talking about violence against children, because research shows that violence has a negative impact on all of these areas. So it can actually, children who are experiencing violence physically can be smaller than other children. It impacts on their cognitive, emotional, and social development as well. So this can be used in various ways. It's really just a way to make it more visual and understandable. So that's the first diagram that I would like to share with you. And then I have more pictures because I'm a very visual person. What I did when I was doing some work on juvenile justice was I read some of these papers that have been explaining this since the 1990s, the incredible developments that have been made in this field, and I tried to simplify it for myself so I could understand it. So this is very simplified, and I'm sure that if one of these clever people were here, they would say, oh, well, that's not exactly right, but so bear with me, okay? So what happens is we now know that the brain doesn't really fully develop, at least in kind of until the mid 20s. So the behavior that children are engaged in, particularly during adolescence, is because the brain is still developing. And there are 5 things I want to share about this. So the first thing is this part of the brain, very imprecisely, not to scale model. This is the frontal lobe of the brain, and this is where the clever thinking takes place, the higher cognitive functions. So things like reasoning, weighing up decisions, that kind of thing, assessing risk. This is the most difficult, complicated bit of the brain. It's the last to develop. It's going through the fastest development of any other stage of life during adolescence. But what it means is that children, they may not be able to fully understand the pros and cons and reason in a way that adults might be able to. But it kind of gets slightly worse than that, because during this period of development, there's another part of the brain that kind of stands in and tries to fill the gap. And this part of the brain is like the lizard emotional part of the brain. So you've got a lot of kind of emotional and less rational thinking in some cases. Now, I should obviously stress that every child is different, okay? We are not saying that all children are disorganized, adolescents unable to make rational decisions, because we know that's not the case, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So we have these, this is 2 things going on. There's another one that I want to throw in, which is that the brain during adolescence is being flooded with crazy chemicals, testosterone, dopamine, and these have all kinds of effects, but it basically means, as you know, that teenagers kind of get very hormonal, and maybe quite emotional and things. It's a physical reality of what's happening in their brain. And also, these little connections here. It's a time when connections are being made within and between parts of the brain. And this is a time where it's really, really important to cement this in a positive way. The more you can get children and adolescents kind of thinking carefully, weighing things up, you're going to cement these links, which will last a lifetime. If you don't, then they will start to die off, and we kind of miss an opportunity. So all of this kind of means, the 5th kind of thing is that, and researchers have likened this to an adolescent being a car with a strong kind of accelerator pedal and a very weak brake. So they overemphasize reward. So for example, hey, yeah, I'm going to steal this car and joyride because it's going to be really great, it's going to be really good fun, we're all going to have a really good time. And this kind of reward center, it's a higher threshold that adolescents need to get that kind of kick of reward, but they will overemphasize that and they will underemphasize the risks and the negative consequences. So risk-taking is a natural part of adolescent development, and there is obviously a very strong link between that and juvenile justice coming into conflict with the law. I'm sure we have all done crazy things when we were teenagers, but that's another story. Anyway, so we have some potentially not great decision-making, and just one last thing to say about that. This is not to say that adolescents and children are hopeless and we should just write them off because they're just immature and their brains are not big enough or clever enough to understand complex things. That is not the case at all. What this means is that this is a perfect opportunity to cement these strong connections in the brain. And this is my last little bit down here. Cold cognition. This is situations where things are calm and children and adolescents have the opportunity to develop and exercise these kind of critical thinking skills. Imagine you are sat calmly around the dinner table, having a discussion, you're involving your child, how was your day, what are you going to be doing next week? And they say they want to do, let's think about the pros and cons of that. What do you think? It's a calm situation, and the brain in that situation has really good opportunities to develop and strengthen. So really, really good opportunities to do that. However, when you get in a hot cognition area, this is, for example, in a nightclub, lots of music, lots of lights flashing, peer pressure, alcohol, substances, saying, hey, yeah, let's go and steal that car, yeah. And it seems like a really good idea. It's not the best time. But the more that you strengthen these processes here, the better resilience children will have to make good decisions in these kind of situations. Okay, so incredibly simplified. I'm sure there are brain scientists around the world going, oh my goodness, what she just said. But in crude terms, there are really, really strong reasons as to why we need to treat children and adolescents differently, particularly in the justice system. So they will make mistakes as they're growing up, and it's really important how we deal with that the first time. We need to be emphasizing this responsibility for actions, not locking them away and other things. That's my second diagram. So moving on. So the next thing I wanted to share was the child rights approach. You may have heard about this. You may have heard about the human rights approach. So this is my way of thinking about this. So for many years, we've treated children as if they are pawns on a chessboard. The pawn is the lowest value piece on a chessboard. And we're very good, especially in kind of from a welfare charity perspective, of saying, oh, poor little child on the street. I don't think it's good for you to be on the street. I think you should go back to your family. Or, oh, no, you definitely shouldn't be on the street. You should be in an institution or an NGO. Okay, so making decisions about children, treating them as objects. Those of you who are familiar with rights in general will know that the rights approach is about transforming that so that children are not objects, they are subjects of rights. So the overall experience of the child rights approach is this transformation from pawn to person or from object to subject. So rather than moving them all around, we need to be accompanying them, understanding the choices they've made in the past, which may be limited or non-choices. Do I stay at home and be raped by my stepfather, or do I go and live on the streets? That's pretty much a non-choice, but we have to understand from their perspective why they have done the things they've done. The second stage is then we explore the choices available to them and expand those choices from now on. We don't make the choice for them, but we help them and support them in those decisions. And then the third step is to accompany them on their journey in terms of the choices that they make. But it's about working with them, listening to them, really understanding from their perspective. So that's the overview of the child rights approach. In a little bit more detail, what's the difference between rights and needs, first of all? Well, if I ask you, which is stronger? I need a glass of water. I have a right to a glass of water. Well, those of you familiar with this concept will know that the right is stronger because there is an accountability mechanism. It can be claimed. So I need a glass of water. Okay, so you might be feeling generous today. Yeah, you might think, oh, yes, okay, yes, oh, you poor thing, yes, let me give you a glass of water. Here you go. But I come back tomorrow. No, I gave you a glass of water yesterday. I'm not going to do it again today. So I'm powerless in this situation. However, if I have a right to the glass of water, I can demand my right, and you have a duty to give me that glass of water. So this is the main concept of rights, is that they can be claimed, they're enforceable. So we have two sides to this. In architecture, the arch is one of the strongest structures that there is. An arch can support really huge buildings. And what we want to do is to support really strong families, communities, societies, and we want to have nice global solidarity. So if you imagine on one side, we have, in the rights framework, the rights holder. And then on the other side, we have the duty bearer. The person is obligated. And this is really the state. In technical terms, the state, the government, is the duty bearer when they sign these human rights treaties. And all agents of the state, that means professionals, doctors, teachers, police officers, probation, judges, so on and so forth. On the other side, we have the rights holder, and this applies to all human rights adults as well. So in human rights treaties in general, that could be any adult that is a rights holder. When we're talking about children and the child rights conventions and things, then the rights holder becomes a child. Now, the idea is we want to build the capacity of both sides to come together. So it is no use, for example, just on one side, building capacity of children to claim their rights, giving them confidence, working with their life skills. So they say, I want my rights, I want my rights. Because if the duty bearers don't understand this, they don't know what that's about, then they're going to get angry, there's potentially going to be a hostile environment that they're going to repress, arrest, lock up these children demanding their rights. And it's not really fair to ask them to do something if they don't fully understand it or they don't have the capacity. So instead, we try to have a collaborative positive approach, building the capacity on both sides. These are the obligations, and this is how we can help you to fulfill them, and it's in the benefits of everybody with our nice strong building societies. So we try and bring these two sides together to meet in the middle. That doesn't always work if you're working with very difficult duty bearers, but then this is why we have the accountability, and there are accountability mechanisms in place in the human rights system. So carrot and stick. Okay, this applies to all human rights. So what about this child rights approach? What's different? Well, we have this wonderful document called the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But it's not just a shopping list of these 41 substantive articles. You can't say, oh yeah, you know, I use a child rights approach because I work on education, and education is Article 28, 29, or I work on health. The way that you work on these issues is just as important as the end goal. Now, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, in their great wisdom, has identified, as you may well know, 4 articles that contain rights considered to be general principles for the whole convention. Sometimes they call them the general principles for short. And the committee also writes every now and then these things called general comments to explain their thinking in a bit more detail. They wrote a general comment, number 13, on violence against children. And in this, they said, well, yeah, we've got these kind of 4 principles that you might have heard of: non-discrimination, best interests of the child, the right to life, survival and development, and the right to be heard and taken seriously. These are kind of articles that lots of people know. But also, we are going to elevate. We think that there are 2 other rights, 2 other articles that have also very, very strong importance for the convention as a whole. One of them is Article 4, which is that states will implement all the rights in the convention according to the maximum extent of available resources. And another one is a really clever article, number 5. Very sophisticated, wonderful instrument, the convention, in many ways. And it says that families and communities should be supported to help children to claim their rights and enjoy their rights. So we're looking really at family and community collaboration. If the family and community is doing something against children's rights that's harming them, then we maybe need to step in. But we also need to build their capacity and help them to help the children. So people often think that the convention is like, oh, child rights is it's so selfish. You know, you're going to have children saying, oh, I've got the right to this. And whereas in our culture, we talk more about community and society. Actually, that's a misinterpretation of the convention. The convention is very, very strong on family and community support for children as well. So anyway, so we've added these 2 rights to the other 4 common general principles, and we've turned them into a table. And this is called the table leg test. So this is just a kind of a visual tool to try and help remember these kind of rights. And if you imagine that a child is sitting on the table, if you are planning a piece of policy, legislation, a program, some kind of NGO project, or I don't know, some intervention on juvenile justice, you need to ask yourself a series of questions, okay? What I'm doing, is it discriminating against any child? If it's targeting a particular group of children, why is that? And will there be a negative impact on other groups and so on? Is it in the best interests? And that's quite complicated. You have to weigh it up against other articles. Is it contributing positively to their right to life, survival and development? And absolutely, is it doing no harm to their right to life, survival and development? Are we engaging with children? Okay, are children being listened to and taken seriously in the planning of our intervention? And also, what's the role of the family and community in this, and how is it being resourced? Okay. So if one of the table legs is not present, or the rug has been pulled from underneath the table is not stable, the child will fall. Okay. So it's a kind of a mental checklist that can be used in varying degrees of complexity for kind of planning project programs. It can even be used when you're face-to-face with an individual child. So imagine that you're a police officer. You know, actually, am I discriminating against this child? Am I treating this child differently than I would another one because he or she is an ethnic minority or whatever? You know, what decision am I going to make right now that's in their best interest, and so on and so on. So it can be used in various ways. And this referral to the Convention on the Rights of the Child is really what distinguishes the child rights approach from the human rights approach. children are human, so they fall under the human rights approach, but we can also draw on these specific articles to make it a bit more targeted because, as we saw earlier, they're in this special stage of development, so they need a bit of special kind of help along the way. So what we do is actually put these two together, the arch and the table. It becomes the arch and table leg, table leg test, and there are a series of questions. The initiative that I'm doing, in addition to this, is it also helping to build the capacity of duty bearers to deliver on their rights? Is it helping to build the capacity of children to claim their rights in relation to whatever it is that I'm planning right now? So there's a whole series of questions that can be used to go with that, and I will give you reference to a resource for that in a minute. And, sorry, I know you're probably getting bored and tired now, but the next diagram is the last one. So what does all this mean? Well, I just wanted to have a word about child rights education. In juvenile justice this week, we've been talking a lot about prevention. Okay, if you imagine a car crash, a lot of times when we intervene, the car crash has already happened. It's horrific, there's a lot of damage, and we're pulling bodies out of the wreckage. Okay, it's already really late, and it's already really complicated to intervene at that stage. What we need is to put good traffic systems in place to avoid the car crash happening in the first place. We need prevention. And we need this kind of universal prevention. So child rights education is rather wonderful. The definition of it is teaching and learning about the Convention on the Rights of the Child, its provisions and principles, and the child rights approach to empower both adults and children to implement all of these in their families, communities, societies, and in the world at large. And that's pretty amazing. If you think, as a vision, if we had every adult and every child in the whole world that not only understood about child rights, but also meant that they respected the rights of others, then it would just be wonderful. I mean, I can imagine that it would, as a magic bullet, it would eliminate a lot of the problems that we see, juvenile justice, child labor, and lots of things, because people would grow up, children would grow up from a very young age, understanding how to work in harmony and live with others and claim their rights when those rights are violated. So this is a wonderful vision for the future, very idealistic, but you know, we have to be visionary sometimes. So there is, in fact, a child rights education toolkit which has been developed by UNICEF, based in Geneva. And child rights education, this process of teaching and learning about all of these things, can happen in many different settings, and you may already be engaged in it. For example, if you imagine different trees on the planet, different areas in which child rights education takes place, might be with professionals. So, for example, police training on child rights, that's child rights education, judges, lawyers, doctors, teachers, and so on. So it might be with professionals. It might be with the general public, you know, like big media messages, article, newspaper explanations, radio broadcasts explaining what rights are. So that's another way that you can have child rights education. You can have child rights education, particular groups of children out of school and so on. This particular toolkit, because of the way it was developed and the countries with whom it was developed, focuses on a kind of a particular tree in the forest, which is actually child rights education in formal education settings for early childhood education, primary and secondary schools. So it is focused on the formal school system, but a lot of the approaches, it explains all of this about the child rights approach, a lot of the approaches are applicable to all of these other settings and they could be adapted for that. So I highly recommend looking at this toolkit. It explains the child rights approach. It goes through this pawn-to-person arch table leg test, and it has a checklist of questions as well to help you apply the child rights approach in practice. So I can just show you what the toolkit looks like. Here it is. So there is the toolkit itself, and we use the image of a tree to explain it. There are some separate appendices, very practical tools for use mapping curriculum and things in school. And there are also a series of flyers, which if you don't want to read the whole thing, still very interesting. Ta-da! Look, it's the table leg test, the arch and table leg test, a definition of the child rights approach. And that just kind of explains different initiatives in school and things. So if you're interested to find out more about the Child Rights Education Toolkit, the flyers, you can download all of these at this website. And also here you will find other things that you may find interesting, like a police training manual on basic child rights, which includes explanation of that child development diagram and things. There's a series of training manuals for working with children in street situations, basic approaches, prevention, specifically in relation to children in street situations, and also family reintegration. There's all sorts of kind of useful resources there, including this child rights education toolkit. Thank you very much for your attention. I wish you the very best of luck. Before I go, if you're ever feeling discouraged, in your work. We work in difficult circumstances. We work with some of the most difficult children, horrible situations, nasty stories of abuse. Just so that you feel a little bit more empowered, just remember, for every single child that you help, for every child whose life you changes, even if it's just one, it's actually not just one, because you'll be changing the lives of their family and their friends and their children and their children's children. So the impact that you have is actually a lot bigger. Do you see the love hearts in between there? And then if you work with others, thank you, if you work with others, then imagine if you all join up together with all of your initiatives, then you have a wonderful long paper chain of happy children with their rights fulfilled. So don't be discouraged. The work that you do is really, really important. And just focus on that if you're ever feeling a little bit down. And in the meantime, we work to our vision of every adult, every child being aware of rights and the rights of others. Thank you very much. Bye.